I've always enjoyed the Xeno series of games from Monolith Soft over the years. Much like Final Fantasy, the games share a partial title throughout the Xeno sagas on PS2 and Xenoblades on the Wii and onward, but many of them have completely different, disconnected stories. One game I had never played all the way through, though, is what I'm looking at today, the original Xenogears on the PS1. If you aren't familiar with the Xeno series and how these games generally roll, the transition from Xenogears' anime-styled introductory cutscene to the starting gameplay is incredibly wild, going from a very high-tech starship to an out-of-the-way village, with no obvious connection between the two, and while the connection will eventually be revealed about 50 hours later, it's just the beginning of an absolutely wild ride, full of things you won't understand, some of which you won't even understand until after the end credits. But before we delve into the game's plot, we should talk about how it plays. On a basic level, Xenogears is very much what you'd expect from a JRPG of its era. Smaller, focused areas like cities, towns, and forests scattered across a large open map that you traverse first by walking, and eventually by slowly improving vehicles. The major gameplay differences in these games are generally found in their combat systems, and Xenogears is no exception. Thankfully, Xenogears really shines in its combat, which is quite unique and a lot of fun. For starters, there are really two combat modes, on foot and in the game's mechas known as gears. While they're similar, there are some pretty big differences. The big thing they have in common, however, are how physical attacks work. While the combat is always turn-based, as you'd expect, performing advanced high-damage dealing physical moves, which the game calls death blows, requires memorizing certain button combinations in order to perform the most powerful attacks. These attacks, in the on-foot mode, are sequences of up to 5 face button presses and are unlocked by performing the right combination of buttons over and over again to slowly build up each death blow's XP. While I appreciate the system in general, it did lead to multiple times where I felt compelled to grind out new death blows as soon as I was able to, a process that required looking at guides to figure out the optimal button combinations to unlock death blows even remotely quickly, and even doing that, it still takes absolutely forever. In Gears, the death blows are much less complex, only ever requiring 2 buttons. However, when in your mech, you have to be much more careful about health and resource management. When you're on foot, restoring health and ether, the game's mana equivalent, is as easy as chugging a potion. But when it comes to your gears, restoring your basic resources isn't anywhere near as easy. Primarily, you'll be dealing with the HP of your gear, as well as the amount of fuel it has. Really, it's about balancing the two. A gear can only heal itself, only with a healing accessory equipped, and only by burning a pretty significant amount of fuel. Fuel itself can only be restored by skipping a turn, choosing the charge option, or by talking with specific gear vendors throughout the game that restore fuel and heal your mech. While most dungeons and boss battles will conveniently shove one of these vendors right before particularly dangerous encounters, there are some very tricky parts of the game where you'll have to face multiple bosses in a row, requiring very careful fuel and health management. All of this, everything I just described, makes the turn-based combat a whole lot more interesting than it could be otherwise. There are a ton of other turn-based JRPGs that came out both before and after Xenogears that get nowhere near the inventiveness it does. And that extends well beyond its gameplay. Xenogears can also look incredible at times. The base of the graphical style was somewhat common at the time, a combination of 2D and 3D styles, based on the scale of things in the world. People are always 2D, while gears, buildings, and structures are always 3D. They're doing the most they possibly can with the PS1. Maybe not in the technical sense, but definitely in an artistic one. There are some truly stunning moments in the game where it hits just right. And despite the fact that it's 26 years old now and objectively dated, it remains just as impressive as it was then, with unique and beautiful environments all their own. In retrospect, it's no wonder they ran out of money before they finished telling their story, but we'll get to that in a bit. Despite being a very linear JRPG in a lot of ways, it makes an effort at many points to give you a certain amount of freedom, just enough to make you fully engaged in a way that most other JRPGs of the time didn't. The combos that make up the combat system are definitely a part of that, but tiny little touches, like the fact when you're talking to NPCs you can choose to just walk away and dialogue will keep flowing until you're completely out of range of them, just like a real conversation you might have with someone without standing directly in front of them. Things like walking up a long set of stairs that could be automated while the dialogue flows, you actually control, and the dialogue keeps going in text boxes while you do. You feel immersed not only when you're in combat, but also when you're in the story, and it feels so incredibly good when you're actually playing it. The story as a whole is pretty good. It seems kind of rote now to start. I just about rolled my eyes early on when one of the game's antagonists starts talking about killing God, as much of a trope as that's become among every JRPG, but because of the way the story is told and what it's trying to get at is fantastic, especially for the time. Everything is very biblical in nature, speaking of prophecies and gospels and gods and the like. In fact, the game barely ever misses a chance to philosophize directly at you. It certainly attempts comedic moments as well, with one specific character whose only purpose seems to be comic relief, to an absurd degree that can often detract from some of the game's most dramatic sequences. The game's heavy focus on its story does mean that you'll go a very long time without engaging in combat sometimes, which does serve to make it more exciting when it finally does come. After all, JRPG combat has a tendency to grow dull and repetitive. But in its first disc, Xenogears finds the perfect balance of narrative and combat, allowing each one to keep the other in check. I never felt overwhelmed either by too much combat or too much story. This makes it very unfortunate that while I think the overall plot is very well done and it weaves its themes into the gameplay very well, the translation can be extremely distracting at times. Most of the time, it's fine enough, if not amazing, and it's at the level of serviceability you'd expect from this era. But during some very crucial points, you'll notice some incredibly glaring mistakes, from repeated words to incredibly odd phrasing. There was no point where it completely hampered my ability to comprehend what was going on in an individual conversation or anything like that, but in a game with the massive amount of text that Xenogears has, it can stand out quite a bit. That being said, it's very important to note that the vast majority of the translation was done by a single person, Richard Honeywood, in an incredibly short time. And due to the extreme amount of text, it was almost completely scrapped. There's a fascinating story there in general about how the two other translators who were working on the game previously quit over concerns that the game's religious theming would endanger their safety. A legitimate concern back in the 90s, and one that Honeywood also shared at times. It's a fascinating story I don't have time to get into here, but one that Honeywood has shared in various venues, and is well worth a look if you're interested. At the end of the day, when it comes to the final product, it's one of those things where, while it may be far from ideal, if the alternative was us not getting a translation at all, I'll happily take the mediocre one. That translation does make what's already a pretty dense story even harder to comprehend, however, and many fans have taken to external resources to better understand what was going on. And that was shared even among those who played the game in its original Japanese language incarnation, to the point where there's a book, Xenogears Perfect Works, that greatly expands on the world's backstory, as well as its main plot in a way that stitches everything together. If not in a way that makes sense, at least in a way that can be understood. Like a lot of its contemporaries outside of its core gameplay and storytelling, Xenogears is constantly introducing new small mechanics and minigames, some of which are fun for a little bit, like a card game that you get to play, but others are extremely obnoxious, like swinging from a rope, which has its own entire set of needlessly complex mechanics and struggles with the camera for what ends up being a single rope in one dungeon in the entire game. In fact, in a related note, this game has some of the worst forced platforming I've ever seen in a JRPG, not only because the fixed angle camera can make it a nightmare, but also because if you hit a random encounter while jumping, it stops you in midair, possibly setting you back massively if you fall. So I often found myself forcing random encounters to occur so I wouldn't hit one when I jumped. Unfortunately, now we come to a bit of a twist. Despite some minor qualifications, everything I've mentioned up to this point is almost entirely talking about the first of the 2 discs that make up Xenogears. I've alluded to it enough, it's time to rip off the band-aid and talk about Disc 2, the most infamous part of the game. Basically, the story goes that while making the game, the developers ran out of money and were unable to complete what they had originally intended to, meaning basically the entire back half of the game had to be severely compressed. You can literally see entire sections of the game drawn out that you would have played through, cut down to a few storyboards, maybe an animation or two. A very common sight becomes this screen with a focused character sitting in a chair in front of a screenshot, with a giant page of text getting shoved in your face. Even the battles the game gives you occasionally through these sequences that clearly would have originally had dialogues between characters in them just have text containing what a character said. It is such an incredible shift in tone and pacing that brings the entire proceeding to an absolute stop. There are some incredibly bright spots on the second disc, however, that make me hesitate to recommend something like just watching all of the second disc in someone's YouTube video. Some of the boss fight sequences do serve as mechanically interesting interludes between the endless pages of text and still images, and the game does give you one incredibly satisfying last ride, one last taste of the wide open world, letting you poke around and find new things that you weren't able to access before, including several new areas to explore and find some of the best gear the game has to offer, as well as an incredibly important story scene that is completely missable if you don't bring a specific character to a very specific place. The state of the world is also a bit shocking here, since it has been so long since you've been able to freely explore it, and a massive amount of stuff has happened in PowerPoint presentations since then. And it all leads up to a frustrating maze of a final dungeon, a climactic and enjoyable final boss fight, and an ultimately reasonably satisfying ending to the game. An ending that is dramatically improved if you have looked at some wikis or some Perfect Works excerpts. Admittedly, something hard to do without spoiling yourself on what's about to happen. So you end up with something that is terribly split. Disc 1 is maybe one of my favorite JRPGs of all time, and standing on its own, I could not give it more of a glowing recommendation. It nails its world, its combat, its atmosphere, its story. Everything is absolutely top-notch. Disc 2, on the other hand, is a poorly paced, bloated disaster that veers into visual novel territory more often than not, that not only exacerbates every small issue I had with Disc 1, but introduces a ton of its own. Still, I think this game, in its entirety, is absolutely worth playing today. There are massive qualifiers around that statement, and you have to put up with a whole lot of garbage on that second disc. But the fact that I went through all that and still came out on the other end extremely positive on the game as a whole is a ringing endorsement all its own. This game spawned an entire studio devoted to making spiritual successors, and those successors not only continue to this day, but often you can see tiny little glints of Xenogears in them. And while the direct references may have decreased in number, you can still easily draw a direct line between every game that has followed and the original. A game I think anyone who has ever enjoyed a JRPG should at least give a try.